The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.
Mike, if I were a better singer, I'd be singing the classic tune, The Electric Company from the 70s, but I'm not. So today, Mike, how are you? How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I would have loved to hear. I've never heard that song, but I'm sure you would have done a great rendition.
Maybe another day, perhaps at a when we go do karaoke.
Yeah, our final podcast. It'll be the best of all the songs you wanted to sing over the episodes that you never did.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason why I bring up the electric company is because we have a clean energy company on today. We had Cutis VanWalleghem from Hydrostor, really transformational energy storage company that's really enabling renewable energy plays around the world, and it's homegrown. We found out today he's from Kenora, so that was super exciting. It's always good when we find out tidbits sort of opportunistically throughout the podcast that we didn't know of and didn't prepare for. So it was great to have Cutis on.
Yeah, no, I think again, I think it was I think one of the things that stuck out to me as well, and we kind of talked about this though, is that obviously when he described his journey and some of the early funding he got from places like OCE, like that's like a textbook example of like how those industry academic partnerships are meant to begin. And then ultimately, 12 years later, you see where they are now and the work that they're doing. I think like hopefully if anyone from OCI is listening, that is the case study to have out there and kind of talk about how, again, early stage, you had grad students and props working on the engineering, and then now, they're commercialized, right? But again, that wouldn't have happened without, I think, a lot of those programs and supports to bring in experts like that from universities and colleges to help with that early research.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said in the episode, and you'll hear, I mean, that's exactly what we had always hoped for when we rally around these companies at the funding agencies. So you'll hear more about that, and you'll hear more about that right now as we go to Cutis VanWalleghem. We're pleased to be joined by Cutis VanWalleghem, who is the CEO of Hydrostor. Cutis has been CEO of Hydrostor since its inception and has led the company through technology development into commercial operations. Prior to Hydrostor, Cutis was senior manager in Deloitte's corporate strategy consulting practice, and he has advised and consulted for some of the top energy companies globally. He's also held positions at nuclear generator Bruce Power and wind developer Environmental Electric Company. And we're so pleased to be joined by Cutis today. Thank you, Cutis.
Excellent. Yeah, really glad to be here.
So Cutis, that was your professional bio, but we always know that there's a lot more underneath what is written on the page. So before we get into the exciting work you're doing at Hydrostor, could you tell us a bit more about your sort of journey as a person and as a professional?
Yeah, certainly. I guess I grew up in the northwestern Ontario, a town called Kenora, about 6 hours northwest of Thunder Bay. And had a great upbringing up there. Played hockey, a lot of outdoors stuff, snowmobiling, and then moved down to Toronto to play varsity hockey for University of Toronto and do engineering. After engineering, and playing hockey for 4 years, I did my MBA at University of Toronto as well. Went over a volunteer in India, doing some volunteer work there, and then joined consulting and hopped on a plane and lived out of hotels for 10 years. And then it seems like I've been on the hamster wheel ever since. So that's me in a nutshell.
I'm going to really have to suppress Mike because he's also a hockey fanatic, a hockey author. So maybe at the end, if we have some time, he'll want to pepper you with some questions, but we'll have to suppress him.
Yeah, well, my hometown, Kenora, won the Stanley Cup. So there you go. Smallest town to win it.
The Thistles. Yeah, I've written about the Kenora Thistles back in the day. So yeah, that's that jumped out at me too. The other thing I was going to say is that Steve and I are also familiar with Kenora because they've got some great beer there as well. So we didn't know about that background of yours, so that's great to have that as part of the show now too. But yes, definitely Kenora Thistles. They've always had a place in my heart. So but we'll save the hockey for maybe later another time. Obviously one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you was about the transformative technology of Hydrostor. And I know that Steve and I seem like we're really smart guys. And in fact, we actually have worked with, we've done some projects that have focused on compressed air energy storage systems in the past. But for our listeners who may not be familiar with compressed air energy storage systems, can you kind of explain Hydrostor in a nutshell?
Yeah, so it's a mechanical energy storage. So you think of it like a battery. We don't generate power, we store it. So we charge up, hold the power, time shift it, and then give the power back. But instead of using a chemical reaction like a battery, or pumped hydro, which pumps water up on top of a hill and holds it there, and then when you want it, you use that potential energy to spin a fan. What we do is we take off-peak electricity to run an air compressor, compress air, and when you do that, just like in your bike pump, it gets hot. And so when that air comes out compressed and hot, we strip the heat out, store that in a hot water tank, and then that compressed air that's been cooled down, we send 600 meters underground where it fills a rock cavern that we built. And as it's displacing the water that's otherwise there, that water is being lifted up and stored in a little surface pond. So it's kind of like a mix of pumped hydro and compressed air. And then a valve holds it in. And when you want power, the valve opens, the weight of that water brings the air up, it collects the heat again, and then spins a turbine to reproduce power. And the big advantage of it over pumped hydro is it only uses 5% of the space and water. So it's much more compact, and it can be built anywhere there's bedrock. Instead of pumped hydro, which needs 2 lakes with a big elevation. So really easy to site, flexibly to site, and very, very compact, and much cheaper than batteries. So that's it in a summary.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think it's important to take a step back, because where did this idea come from? What was the sort of genesis of the IP that you guys have commercially available now?
Yeah, so I was working at Bruce Power when the Green Energy and Economy Act came in, and that really said that, all the clean stuff gets dispatched first, ahead of even nuclear. And that meant that we had to start turning up and down the nuclear reactors, which they weren't really meant to do. And so that's when I really got exposed to the need for storage. So then I went on the hunt for storage to see if we could solve the problem at Bruce Power. And I met a guy from the oil patch, Cameron Lewis, who had this idea. And he said that compressed air has been around for a long time, but it had 2 issues or limitations with it. And that he saw equipment from the oil patch that could fix that. And so the 2 innovations that he was bringing to the table was the one, which was the thermal management, storing all that heat via heat exchangers and pressure vessels. And then the second was, instead of only going where there's salt caverns, which is what conventional compressed air did, he said that the hydrocarbon industry stores these hydrocarbons in these rock caverns. So he said, if you use a rock cavern, but you flood it with water, that allow you to go almost anywhere, be very compact. And because you need such little space compared to a salt cavern, it makes the economics very similar to that. So that was really his brainchild, to come up with those 2 innovations on top of a compressed air, which is pretty well known and well proven technology. And then we were off to the races, and a 12-year overnight success, because it's quite a long road to take it from a concept, patent it, work through all the engineering, build small scale systems, get the ability to wrap them, that sort of thing. And that's a journey we've been on since 2010.
Well, and kudos to you, right? Because this is not a software startup, right? When you're doing big hardware, it's daunting for sure. We've seen that with some of the partners that we've worked in the past. Now you say about the flexibility of site. Could you offer for our listeners, what are some obvious use cases that you really like when you're speccing the system? What's a good sort of low-hanging fruit use case that you have this for?
Yeah, so what we tend to do is you go to markets that have a high renewable penetration. And the reason is they've got volatility in the energy markets. And often prices even go negative. So you get kind of paid to charge. And then to firm up that renewables, often places will use gas, like Texas as an example. So that puts a cap on how much you can make with the storage system. But if you go places that won't permit new gas, like California, now you got high renewables, but they can't use gas to firm it. That's when storage really has a strong business case. And so there you get about half of your revenue from what's called a capacity payment to just be there to firm things up. And the other half comes from buy low, sell high, just arbitrage, simplistic. So that's kind of the base business model. There's others where you can co-locate with big wind farms and then offer it kind of baseload, wind or solar. We're looking at some stuff in Africa where we'll solar with our system serving off-grid mines to displace the need for diesel. Will be another kind of use case. And the last one I'd mention is debottlenecking the transmission grid. So often the transmission lines, their utilization factor is not that high, and they're bottlenecked along the way. But if you put storage at the strategic nodes, you can debottleneck it and you can get a payment from the transmission company. And then you combine that with some arbitrage and whatnot to make the business case go round. So that's it in a nutshell. But our projects are pretty big. So for us, they're capital cost 500 million to $1 billion. So, we don't need tons and tons of them. For us, we look very strategically around the world and pick our places to kind of start developing, investing in projects.
And Curtis, I know you've already kind of touched on this a bit, especially with your system and how, it doesn't use fuel to get the energy. But in terms of other alternative energy offerings on the market right now, what would be the key differentiator for Hydrostor?
Yeah, so there's lithium ion batteries, which are really good for the short duration, maybe 1, 2, 4 hours. And they're rapid response. So they're good at what ancillary service market is what we call it, but that's kind of short duration. And then there's really long, like seasonal, which is probably going to be done by hydrogen as an example. Where we fit is kind of that 6 to 24 hours of storage duration. So when we start discharging, that's how long we go for. And we run almost every day. In that market, it's really us, pumped hydro, as the proven solutions. There's flow batteries, which are coming, but they haven't quite got down the cost curve yet. So they're still a little bit expensive. And then there's a bunch of other gravitational and thermal solutions that are proposed and going through pilot plants, if you would. A lot of them have some promise, but they'll have a tough time achieving our cost and performance, but they can be built at smaller scales. So they might beat a battery, can't quite beat us, but if a big cement plant needs something behind the meter and it's too small for us to go, those would be really neat applications. So there's Malta's got a thermal system. Highview's got a liquid air system. And so there's a range of different solutions like that. And then there's other stuff that's being proposed that doesn't seem like it's really going to pan out. But, kudos to people for trying a whole bunch of different solutions.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on something you said. And then if we did a bit of research in looking into Hydrostor ahead of time, you mentioned an off-grid mining operation in Africa. And you recently partnered with a group in New South Wales to use old mine infrastructure, sort of a happenstance locational play. There are a number of, obviously, networks, as you know, as a northern boy of underground mines in Ontario. Do you see that as a particular area you could go into? Because they already have a lot of that infrastructure, and if they don't, they already have that shaft sinking prowess already within the company, and maybe could offer things in partnership. Do you see that as a potential area to go into?
I liked your word opportunistic. The thing is with us, everything below the ground is only about 30% of our capital cost, and so and it's never going to be perfect. So you might save 10, maybe 15% on the cost of a system. But then chances are you have to run extra transmission lines. It's not going to be right by a substation. And then is your revenue there the best you could get anywhere in the world? So we tend to start with where can you get the most revenue? And it can be at orders of magnitude higher than randomly where there happens to be a hole in the ground. But if you start with the revenue and you go into an area and you say, this is where we want to be located, here's where we get the best revenue, there's a substation, and then there happens to be a hole in the ground there, yeah, you look at it, but that's kind of the sequence you go through, as opposed to find holes in the ground and try to build a business case around it, because that's really the challenge that pumped hydro and conventional compressed air, they have such limited sites that's how they approach it, and none of they always get proposed and none of them pencil out because they can never get the revenue. So we flip it on its head with our flexible siting, go where the revenue is, and then you can justify greenfield construction. But if there happens to be some brownfield infrastructure, leverage it. And we do have one in Australia we're doing that on. It also helps us because we can go a little bit smaller if there's an existing hole in the ground. So our next project that we expect to be constructed is a 200 megawatt, 8-hour project in Broken Hill, Australia, and it is leveraging an existing hole in the ground.
That's really interesting. I don't imagine you're so vertically integrated that you also have a tunneling company or shaft sinking company, right? Those are strategic partnerships you look for depending on where the locale is.
Yeah, that's right. Now that said, to give you a sense, there's been maybe 300 of these hard rock caverns constructed over the last 50 years. If our growth projections hold, we could be doing dozens of those per year, which at that point might justify bringing that in-house, because we would then be a dominant kind of purchaser of those services. But walk before you run. So we're scaling up and growing and getting international. But my hope would be that at some point in time that starts to make sense for us to do that, either through a joint venture with an existing company or start bringing those services in-house.
Steve's a manager for our Center for Smart Mining, so this is definitely right up his alley in terms of smart mining. It doesn't get more smart than that. But Curtis, I wanted to switch gears for a minute, because speaking of Steve, in a past life, he'd said offline that he used to work for OCE, now OCI. And we know that in doing research on Hydrostor, that obviously you've received some government support over the years. OCE was one of them. And that's one of the things that Steve and I also like to highlight in the podcast, is especially with these journeys from startups to where you are now, that oftentimes you have a network or ecosystem that supports you in that development. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, support from places like OCE has helped the company kind of move forward in its development.
Yeah, I mean, it was, something you said earlier, Steve, about the hardware versus software. Doing an infrastructure with clean, like venture capital money, is really tough, right? These funds tend to be a 5 or 10-year fund. So they need to invest and then liquidate. And you're telling them, look, I'm not even gonna have a commercial product in 10 years, let alone enough growth that you're gonna be able to IPO the company. So really, really tough. And then Canada's, back in 2010, Canada's startup ecosystem, outside of IT, was nowhere near what it is today. So it was really, really challenging in those days. And a few programs that we never would have made it through without was early support from OCE on connecting us with universities and helping cover professors and graduate students to help us do the early engineering. We also built a pilot system off a Leslie Street spit in Toronto with University of Windsor and Roop Carivo and his team there. And that got us enough data to attract venture capitalists. And so then we got the venture capitalists to come in, but they were like, look, we're willing to give you guys some money, but not enough to build your first kind of on-grid demo plant. That's when the federal government, through Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC, stepped in with a grant, as well as the Ontario government through the Innovation Demonstration Fund. So by having the federal and provincial government give us some grant, that unlocked kind of our first institutional investor, if you would. Before that, it was funded by friends, family, and some angel investors. Now we built a system with Toronto Hydro and Toronto Island that got us enough data and credibility to show our technology made a lot of sense. With that, we were able to leverage it to get a commercial contract to build a small scale plant that was producing revenue for us. And once we had that, we were able to attract some private equity into the business and allow us to grow and expand and start to develop big projects that ultimately would be our source of long-term revenue. And now that we've constructed that Goderich, that first commercial plant in Goderich, and those early dollars that we put into growth turned into big contracts, that then attracted the big money. So Goldman Sachs invested $250 million into us late last year to grow and go global. And so, I think over those 12 years, those programs, grant programs, as well as the SHRED program, the R&D tax rebates, no way we could have got where we're going without it. And it also takes very brave investors. I know Tom Rand early on with Arcturn Ventures, but also personally, he invested at the very beginning of Hydrostor, took big risks because he believed in the need for the climate battle. And then Curtis Bartlett and Ron Miller from Lorem Partners out of Calgary got involved with us in about 2016. And again, it was just smart business people with a long-term vision, and they weren't boxed in by a fund or rules, and they didn't necessarily care how the crowd would look at things. They had their internal conviction, and they've had enough success that they believed in what they saw. And so it was a combination of right environment, Canada supporting us, the right time with climate change really coming on the agenda, and then came across some very forward-thinking people like Tom, Curtis, and Ron that allowed us to get to where we're at. And even with all those lucky breaks and great people, it was still extremely hard.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was, as we talked about earlier. I think it's so funny because we'd sit back in strategy sessions and look at companies like Hydrostor and see how it could go. And I'm so happy to see that, those early investments really, like, this is how it really should go if the ecosystem, helps a partner. So I'm actually really proud to see that that this has worked out this way so far for you. And it's a really good story that shouldn't disqualify or discourage others who are looking to make these sort of big capital plays, because we need these kinds of big capital companies to take on big problems like climate change. That's not going to necessarily be a software solution that does that kind of thing, right? So I wanted to just ask you, you mentioned some key people there. Is there starting to be a clean tech investment culture in Canada? What's sort of the state of play of that? You went to Goldman to get your most recent funding, but is there starting to be sort of a culture of investing in these kinds of things here, or do we have lots to go?
No, it is really coming to its own now. I think ArcTurn, it was what was previously the Mars Clean Tech Fund. They were kind of early, I guess, dedicated to clean tech, but now there's some really sizable funds, whether it's Cycle Capital, ARC Financial out of Alberta, Evoke Innovations on the West Coast, even Kensington Capital here in Toronto for a bit later stage. But there's more and more, and McKinnon Bennett out of Montreal. There's a lot of great funds coming up, and their check sizes are just getting bigger and bigger. Their funds are getting bigger and bigger. But you needed those first couple of funds and then them to show positive returns. And I think that's happened now. And now they're getting trusted with more money. And then that's rolling. Then you get BDC putting in dedicated clean tech funds. So it really is tipping and it's going in the right direction now because of the positive success. I think there was a clean tech 1.0 that didn't work out so well for investors. And but this time I think it's for real, just like with the web, it crashed there in 99, 2000. And I think people would be tough time saying the internet's not a good investment opportunity. So same with clean tech, it had a bit of a false start, then it got going, took us a bit to build scale. Now for us, we did reach out in Canada. Because we do big infrastructure, we needed a big check. And the people that cut those $250, $300 million checks in Canada, looks more like the pension funds than a venture fund. And they just don't quite go as early as we are. Now in the US, they've got people that cut $1 billion checks. And so 250 million, there are groups like Goldman that come earlier with that size of check. And so that was the dynamic that we got caught up in. But I've no doubt that Canada will be there cutting those checks here pretty soon, and already is there for the lion's share of clean tech companies.
That's exciting. And I wanted to kind of go back to, I think you'd mentioned it in passing in a couple of the answers so far, but obviously talking about, the climate battle and the climate crisis. Can you talk a little bit about how, obviously Hydrostor fits into, mitigating climate change and where you potentially see the company going, especially as you talked earlier about how, in the coming years, we could see dozens and dozens of these caverns being sunk every year to kind of facilitate the development of these sites.
Yeah, so that really is our mission, is to accelerate the energy transition. So energy transition to us means get off coal and gas, get off combustion engine cars, and electrify everything with renewable energy. And so if that's the transition, you've got to move all the vehicle fleet to electric. The grid's got to double or triple in size. And right now it's 80% fossil fuel. Shut that down and triple it in size with all renewable. And so that's a massive undertaking, trillions and trillions of dollars. every time we build a plant, so if we build 100 megawatts of long duration storage, it enables 600-700 megawatts of renewables. It firms up that multiple of renewables, and it shuts down a coal plant every time we do something like that. And so our goal is, how many can you do? We also, because we use all hydrocarbon components and services, the supply chains, we can build 10 of these a year, in parallel, in all continents. And we keep that workforce working. So Baker Hughes makes the compressors and turbines. They make them for the oil and gas industry, but they're the exact same ones they serve us. So as that industry starts to sunset, we can keep those same factories working. We use the same workers that build the same caverns, same operators as refineries. And so we view it as helping to transition the workforce and the supply chain, leveraging that supply chain so we can do things at such a scale that we really can accelerate that energy transition. Wind and solar is so cheap now. The question is just the limiting factor of it getting more and more on the grid is just needs that firming capacity, like storage to do it. So it'll still take decades, but there's a pathway, and an economic pathway where the costs don't go through the roof, and in fact can go down in some cases.
I really appreciate that comment about not displacing the workforce, because I think that's one of the last sort of pieces that people hold up when you want to transition from fossil fuel economies is, what do we do with all the coal miners in whatever state, right? There's jobs for people like that aren't too different from the jobs they have now in the green economy, right? So I really appreciate those comments for sure. We see that in mining a lot. We were making diesel equipment, but we're also now starting to make electric equipment for underground. And those are the same people. They just need a bit different training to do the build out of different equipment, right? So definitely appreciate that. I wanted to ask you, we were mining your bio on LinkedIn, and we noticed an interesting thing called Unreasonable. And I hesitate after looking it up to ask you about this, because I worry it's like Fight Club and you'll have to kill me or something if you talk about it. But can you talk a bit about what it means to be an unreasonable fellow, if you can? I know it's invite only, and how it supports entrepreneurs looking to bend history in the right direction.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting group started by this guy, Daniel Epstein, out of Colorado. And he was a serial entrepreneur, and then he just realized that instead of starting one company, he wanted to start a company that supported a lot of entrepreneurs and push them all forward. And so he started this invite only, where they have a team of scouts. They analyze different markets, whether it's training, educating kids, bringing off-grid electricity to Africa, helping with food shortages, climate change. And they handpick a handful in North America, Europe, and Asia. So about 5 to 10 entrepreneurs a year. And Barclays is behind them with money. And then they fly us all in for like week or 2 week long sessions. They'll bring in amazing speakers and really high profile people, Arianna Huffington and Desmond Tutu and all these different, very inspirational and connected speakers, as well as a lot of investors. And they manage a network of investors and contacts. And the idea is you get invited in, they fly you in, they supercharge your network. They provide connections. They have kind of like a private LinkedIn thing online. So if I go in there and I say, I'm looking to enter Sweden, it'll bring up everybody in the network within Sweden, investors, political people, everything. And then I have a direct line to them to get on the phone, get on a video chat. So it's a private network of really smart, nice people. Like there's kind of a no jerk policy there. And it's just a lot of really good people, and everyone's willing to help each other out. So a week doesn't go by, someone from the network doesn't ask me for a contact, or that I'm reaching out to people for a contact. And the cohort that I went through in North America, still close friends with a lot of those people. And then every couple of years, they'll fly our cohort to Europe to meet up with a bunch of Asian cohorts and host us at a nature reserve or something like that. So really cool network, and has been quite helpful in expanding my network and helping us to open some doors that otherwise I wouldn't have had an access to open.
Cool. So now we have to destroy this tape, I bet, right?
It'll
They
self-destruct
keep it
after
mysterious. They're good marketers over there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Curtis, thanks so much. You've been so generous with your time. And again, I know that we'll have to have you back on. We can talk further about the Kenora Thistles and the Stanley Cup Championship in 1907, but we'll save that for another day. So again, thanks so much for joining us, and best of luck. We look forward to seeing, how Hydrostor continues to develop and, in the fight against climate change.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Steve. Really enjoyed the chat today.
Steve, great chat with Curtis. What do you think?
Had a great time. Again, one of those things where we had heard about the company before, and they're just growing by leaps and bounds every year. Really interesting to hear that they got that $250 million investment from Goldman, which is, I'm sure, transformational for the company and could make them go even further.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, especially when you talked about how, it's been a 12-year journey, but it's obviously 12 years is not long of a time, right? But I think just the shift in the landscape in Canada in terms of supporting, clean tech ventures like that obviously at that time in 2010 when they would have, first started doing this work, it probably was a very nascent, landscape. And obviously there's a lot of support now. I think you're still getting a lot of the support from places like the United States, but still, I think it's a positive sign that, Canada is kind of growing beyond, I think some of these ecosystems where you associate like obviously IT, in Waterloo, but I think over the past couple of guests that we've had and, having people like Megan Simpson from Beta Tech, like you see that there's all these like vibrant, ecosystem pockets in tech and hardware and software all across Canada. It's really great to see that variety.
Yeah. And I think, when he was talking about when they were first getting started, it wasn't like that. So this has been relatively quick that, Canada's sort of getting its act together and supporting these companies. And it often comes down to individuals. And then you could see that with his shout outs to some of his early investors. Tom Rand, I've seen him speak a few times, and, he takes this very seriously, these kinds of things. So it's really good to see that a very capital intensive tech startup like Hydrostor has been able to get investment and grow most of their growth so far in Canada. So, so don't be discouraged if you're a college or university student that has an idea, or indeed if you're an engineer out there that sees something. There is investment available for capital intensive projects. So keep pushing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing I wanted to kind of just address for the listeners too is that you called Curtis an unreasonable fellow, but I thought he was quite a reasonable, generous, person with his time with us this morning.
Yeah, I thought he was super reasonable, very Canadian of him. No, I mean, of course, we had to ask about that when we saw that on his LinkedIn and we looked up the organization. We're like, what the heck is that? I mean, it's something that you and I will never get invited.
I was gonna say, I think the only way that we'll get insights into Unreasonable is having guests on who happen to be fellows in that organization, because certainly they are not scouting you and I.
But one thing we will share, and probably the only thing we'll share with Unreasonable, is we both have a rule: don't work with jerks or don't work with a-holes. And I think that is something that I think has been really instructive for us too. Is you got to like the people you partner with, and that's something that I'll always give advice to people: is if you don't like the person, it's probably not meant to be.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more.
Cool. Well, great. Again, thanks to Curtis for coming on and telling us about Hydrostor. I know that we're going to see more and more of that company globally. So it was great to have him on. They've already launched and are doing great things, but maybe in a couple of years he'd be too big for our podcast. So we got him at the right time. Yeah,
no kidding. We'll keep this episode banked. And like I said, again, maybe he's too big to talk about Hydrostor. He's not too big to talk about hockey. So we'll if you and I have to diverge into that conversation as a way in, we can do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that I'm the guy that brings up hockey now, so you don't have to.
It's working out well. I do a pretty good job at not going there, right? We didn't know that he was a hockey player coming in, right? So again, that's maybe on our bad for not we didn't do enough good recon, but again, it's always great when it comes together. And again, coming together full circle was you at OCE, now at Cambrian, this podcast,
it's circular, goes up, down, and around.
Yeah.
Happy Gilmore. All right. That's it before we lose it more. Thanks for listening.
See you next week.
The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.